you've said things in the past in lectures and books and even today, such as if the Gospels inaccurately portray Jesus as, say, a preacher who often spoke about the kingdom of God, or a self-conceived authoritative teacher for some neutrality, if they're not accurate in these recurring traditions, then we should be inclined to be skeptical about the Gospels'
Uh-huh.
reliability in general, or their ability to preserve historical traditions and memory. So my
Uh-huh.
question is about, on the one hand, hyper skeptics who would say, yeah, we should be skeptical. That
Yeah.
they'd say the Gospels are primarily or even solely fictional. But on the
Uh-huh.
other hand, there are some hyper conservatives, or perhaps simply the average lay Christian, who would say that the Gospels are entirely trustworthy accounts of what Jesus said and did. So they would be taken aback when you, and probably most scholars for that matter, assert that a number of things in the Gospels probably did not occur, much less in the precise way described. So, what would you
Uh-huh.
say to each of these sort of extremes on the spectrum, hyperskeptics and hyperconservatives?
Okay. Well, with regard to hyperskeptics, I suppose that I would say at least two things. So the first thing would be this. There are things in the Gospels that I don't believe early Christians made up without historical memory. So we talked about the criterion of embarrassment earlier,
Right.
and this is where it seems to me it picks up some things that are really important. So I don't think early Christians without memory made up the story of their guy being baptized by John the Baptist. I don't think they made up the story that some people thought he was a glutton and a drunkard. I don't think they sat around and said, that'd be a good one. Let's put that one down. Or that he was a friend of toll collectors and sinners. Or that his family in Mark 3 didn't believe in him. Or that some people thought he was possessed by a demon, that he cast out demons by Beelzebul. So I think that there are a number of things in the Gospels for which we have no explanation, or I'm sorry, no better explanation than this is memory. And they're doing the best that they can with these memories. They're writing up the story of the baptism, they have a dove and a voice, and so on and so on. But they're working with a memory. The second thing I would say to a skeptic is that I don't see that skeptical scenarios can explain Paul successfully. So Paul says that he knew a guy named Peter. He knows a guy named James, who is Jesus's brother. He knows of other brothers of Jesus. He knows of another member of the so-called 12. He has been to Jerusalem. He's talked to people who know Jesus, right? If he's talked to one of Jesus's brothers, he and he thinks Jesus is an historical person, and he can quote some of the things that he said, and he has a definite idea of his personality, then that's it. That's it. Paul, all you need is Paul. Paul is writing in the middle of the first century, and he thinks Jesus is an historical figure, and he knows people who knew him. That's it. I don't think you need anything more than that. As far as the hyper conservative goes, uh, you know, I don't know where you start here. Um, I guess I would just start with the order of things in the Gospels. I have this really neat book. It's not to hand right now, but it's a synopsis of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it has all the stories together on one gigantic piece of paper, which is about 6 feet high and 3 feet wide. And what it does is it lists all the stories in Matthew, and then all the stories in Mark, and all the stories in Luke. And then, with regard to the same story, it draws a line from the place in Matthew where it occurs to the place in Mark, and from the place it occurs in Mark to the place in Luke. So it's looking at the same stories. Let's say the pigs ran off the cliff. It's looking at that story and drawing a line from across the Gospels. So here's the thing: if you look at this book, the lines frequently cross. They just do. And if you look at, let's say, Matthew and Mark, the call of Levi, the tax collector, it occurs before the pigs fall off the cliff in Mark, but before it in Matthew. And you see this time and time and time again. So you have to say that the gospel writers were not at least at least two of them were not uh, keen on getting things in order. And by the way, the very earliest commentary we have on the Gospels comes from a guy named Papias, um, an Asian bishop, a bishop in Asia Minor in the probably the first half of the second century, and he has a tradition about Mark, and he says Mark didn't get things in order. So already somebody is comparing the Gospels and saying, you know what, they don't occur uh, in the same order. By the way, you do this. You do this with John also. John has the story of Jesus in the temple. That incident is in um, it's in the Passion narrative the last week in Mark, but it's in chapter 2 in John. It takes place at the beginning of things. So I guess I would emphasize order. Then I would emphasize that they don't agree on wording. So if you look at the three or the four accounts we have of what Jesus said at the Last Supper, and there was only one Last Supper. If you put them side by side, they are not in verbatim agreement. There are differences, considerable differences between Luke, for example, and Mark. They are not the same. The gist of some of the sentences is the same, but nobody, it appears, was trying to memorize exactly what Jesus had said. And um, there are there are differences. Now, when you go beyond different wording and different order, there are also places that I just think they have to be looked at as straight out contradictions. So John says Jesus was crucified at noon. Mark has him put up at the cross at 9 o'clock. I don't know how to harmonize uh, those things. So it's yeah. There's a story of Bartimaeus, right? And this occurs in Mark. It also occurs in Luke. One of them says that this guy was healed while Jesus was approaching Jericho. The other, I can't remember which one is which, says he was healed as Jesus was leaving Jericho. Those are literally contradictions. So, uh, this is another reason for me to stand back and say, well, I think the repeating themes and motifs are going to be the place to start, not a particular saying or a particular story. So those those are the places I guess I would begin with your hyper skeptic and your hyper conservative.